you very much. Yes, now I am ready to answer any questions that you would like to ask me. Please, if you help us. And maybe someone's help if it is in Vietnam.
I have two questions for you, sir. The first one, as a professor, could you tell us what strongest way has Buddhism spread to the Europe, to the West, especially to the United States? The second one is do the Western people believe Buddhism as a religion, or they believe Buddhism as a branch of philosophy?
The very good questions, both of them. Let us then take how did Buddhism come to the West. The very first people who were Buddhists who came to USA and who came to Hawaii and California happened to be those who came to work from China and later Japan on the railroads. We do not know what kind of spiritual support they had, because for the first period we don't see any Buddhist monks or Buddhist temples that have been established in USA to serve them. But many intellectuals in USA had begun by almost the middle of the 19th century to take an interest in Buddhism and Hinduism because they were dissatisfied with Christianity. In 1875, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott and Madame Blavatsky, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, are two people who wanted people to look to Buddhism and the religions of the East because they thought that Christianity was not satisfying their spiritual needs. That was reality at that time. It was the time when Christianity was more interested in expanding in the world, increasing their numbers, and were not adequately responsive to the spiritual aspects, and the people therefore wanted more other religions. In 1893, Chicago completed their celebrations on the 400th year of the coming of Columbus, for which they had an industrial or trade fair in Chicago with what was called the Parliament of World's Religions. And that was the first time that a large audience in USA listened to Buddhism. That same person I mentioned, that Anagarika Dhammapada, was a speaker. He gave a speech on the world's debt to the Buddha. And that is still a very valid document, very good document. I recommend to anyone who reads English, I'm sure it's available even in Vietnamese translation, to read that. And that was one of the very early presentations. And immediately after, a number of people who were interested in Buddhism wanted Buddhist texts to be translated and published in English. They were looking for somebody. They asked Anagarika Dhammapada to come, but he said he had his hands busy with what he was doing in the world. So they found a wonderful Japanese called D.T. Suzuki. D.T. Suzuki came to New York and translated many of the early books from Japanese and Chinese and from Sanskrit, and made especially the Japanese form of Buddhism and especially Zen Buddhism very popular in the state. And it is that made a very big impact in USA and indeed also in the rest of the world as far as Europe and other countries mentioned. Now with regard to England, the situation was different. England, as I said in my presentation, Buddhism came with the knowledge of people through Christian missionaries who first met Buddhism in our countries, and also by the administrators of civil countries. They wrote books, they translated books, they made dictionaries, they wrote grammars, and that's also what was established. And in 1879, an English poet called Sir Edwin Arnold wrote a poem called Life of Nation. And 1881, Orphan wrote a book called Buddhist Catechism. And for a very long time, these were the two books by which the West came to Buddhism. That is my brief answer to the first question, how Buddhism came to the West. That the process that is to become we use the basic understand. Then I will ask then a second question. How do the Westerners look at Buddhism? There are two approaches. There is an intellectual approach and there is a practical approach. The intellectual approach to Buddhism has been through the philosophy of Buddhism. The people have been very inspired by the depth of the Buddha's understanding of philosophical and psychological issues. So they admire Buddhism as a philosophy and they study Buddhism as intellectual pursuit and the emphasis on some aspect. But they are a practical aspect. A large number of people in the West have already chosen some aspect of Buddhism for their practice. They come to the Buddhist temples to meditate, to chant, to go on retreats, to have an experience as a monastic. Now that is a practical experience. And that number of people seem to be growing very rapidly. My effort in my 17 years in Southern California and nearly 30 years in Europe, I have come to the conclusion that that number is increasing. People who want to come to the temple to chant, the temple to meditate, the temple to study, and the temple to experience as a monastic, that number is keeping on increasing. So there is a good balance between Buddhism studied as a philosophy and Buddhism practiced as a religion of choice. And most people have found Buddhism a very important aspect. You can be a Christian, you can be a Hindu, you can be a Muslim and still do some Buddhist practice. They can still come and meditate, they can still come and chant because our Buddhist temples are open to everybody. You won't ask them to say you must be a professor. So that is a great point. Yes, I have a hand there and there. Yes, someone got to ask a question as we said. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Pastor Ananda, you see here, there's a lot of older generations here in this class right now. So my question to you was,
Maybe in your culture or Sri Lanka, do you guys have a method where you can attract younger people to learn about Buddhism at an early age before, you know, they get older or before it might be too late? Because I feel that Buddhism is very beneficial to you in your daily life, and I was wondering if you had any advice on how to attract younger people.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. All of us are here are people who can call ourselves first generation ethnic Buddhists. Now that's a definition of. The question is simply this: do we think in terms of what is applicable to the next generation? The next generation is our young people who are not connected with the original culture from which we come. They are getting used to a culture of science, of music, of culture, and they have their own ideas about their aspirations for the future. Do we have something to give them? Or are we asking them to discover their spiritual path by themselves? It's a question that we have to ask ourselves very seriously. In all our countries, we do not have this problem in the very beginning, because we seem to have a culture which provides some kind of introduction to the Buddhist values, whether you have a formal study or not. Most of you became Buddhist but never went to a Sunday school. Buddhism was never a subject in your school as a subject. But you learned a lot from your mother. You learned a lot from your father, from the family, from the temple, from the monastics. That's an informal education of Buddhism that's in our country. But the young people do not have it. So we are making every possible attempt to make sure